All right, welcome to today's session. So Foresight is very pleased to be hosting this Hydrogen 101 workshop in collaboration with our funders at BC Clean Energy and Major Projects Office. We're very happy to see strong interest from the community and look forward to your participation today. Before we move ahead, I'd like to first acknowledge that the lands on which Foresight's BC office is located, part of the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and has been stewarded by them since time immemorial. I would also like to acknowledge that Foresight operates nationwide and that we acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of these lands. So the goal of today's workshop is to build greater awareness and understanding of hydrogen and the opportunities it presents for BC, with some specific focus on the Northeast. The majority of the session will feature a Hydrogen 101 presentation, where we'll share some background information on hydrogen, including some of its potential roles in the local energy transition. Throughout the session, we'll have a few interactive exercises and poll questions. My colleague Alyssa Kelly, Foresight's Director of Research, will also be available throughout the presentation to respond, where possible, to any questions you may have in the Q&A. At the conclusion of our presentation, we'll take a brief note to share some of the upcoming events that Foresight has. Before we begin the presentation, we'll start with some introductory remarks about Foresight and the work we're doing. And then I'll pass it over to the City of Prince George to discuss their leadership developing a hydrogen hub in the province. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, Foresight Canada helps the world do more with less sustainably. As Canada's largest clean tech innovation and adoption accelerator, we connect public and private sectors to the world's best clean technologies. We de-risk and simplify the adoption of solutions that improve productivity, profitability, and economic competitiveness, all while addressing urgent climate challenges. We're well positioned to lead the green economic transition, having supported over 1,200 companies to generate $500 million in revenue and $1.8 billion in capital support, run 60 industry challenges, created over 8,500 green jobs, and reduced a projected 70 megatons of GHG emissions. First, I'd like to provide a brief overview of the work that our partners at the province are doing and our partnership with them. In March 2023, the government of BC announced the new Energy Action Framework with a commitment to establish a Clean Energy and Major Projects Office. SEMPO, as is known, works across government to help clean energy projects reach final investment decisions and support tangible benefits to BC and Indigenous communities. SEMPO supports the development of a wide range of new clean energy projects, including hydrogen, CCUS, renewable fuels, and emerging energy storage technologies. SEMPO also supports the implementation of key policy actions within the BC Hydrogen Strategy. Our partnership with SEMPO involves the completion of opportunity assessments exploring the development of hydrogen hubs in 4 economic regions of the province. The Lower Mainland, which some of you may have seen our first report that came out earlier this year, the Northeast BC, which we're currently working on, and next year we'll have the Interior BC, which we include the Kootenays and the Okanagan, as well as Vancouver Island. This work intends to support the longevity of the hydrogen sector in all 4 regions by generating interest. Now, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Declan from the City of Prince George for a few words on their work developing Hydrogen Hub locally.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Declan Cristania. I'm the Manager of Economic Development for the City of Prince George. And I've been on a collaboration throughout the region for what we're calling the Northern BC Hydrogen Hub. And so some of this is a very Prince George lens on it, but the initiative itself is a collaboration. It's been a bunch of partnerships across from here to Prince Rupert, and we have chatted with folks up in the Northeast and south of us as well. Let's go to the next slide. One of the things that sort of kicked it off for us is we started to see this emergence of low carbon energy, low carbon fuels starting to be developed in Prince George. That piqued our interest. We had Hydra Energy and Arbios Biotech and Tidewater Renewables all start to develop projects locally. And so we started to pay a little bit closer attention to that sector. It hasn't been, energy and oil and gas hasn't really been our strong suit. It's been an Albertan thing and up in the Northeast. But then we started to see some more proposed projects come our way, and so we started to lean into it. We also got some support from the Clean Energy and Major Projects Office to sort of pursue this. Let's go to the next slide. One of the things that they talk about with hydrogen hubs is sort of how they define it as a region where you can co-locate production and end use. And so we looked at sort of this concept of what ways we can produce hydrogen and other low carbon fuels, and what sectors locally could use it, and then what jobs could come from every little piece along the supply and value chain of the sector. And so we saw it as an opportunity to diversify our local economy. And so we sort of started out on the pursuit of a hydrogen hub development. We quickly found out that Prince George alone, it's not a single community thing. It's definitely a region, and the strengths of the north kind of go along well together with it talks about in this diagram here about export. We have the Port of Prince Rupert, availability of natural gas up in the Northeast, industrial and workforce and research institutions in Prince George, all of them coming together to support and have a climate that's supportive of this economy. Let's go to the next slide. So things that we took action on I'm very proud of these main projects here: permitting case study, our opportunity assessment, the industry engagement and marketing that we've done, as well as the most recent work that we've done was an operating model. So with the permitting case study, one of the things that we heard through SEMPO and through industry was the municipal level of permitting is confusing and often lacking information, and therefore it can lead to some frustrations and essentially departure or attrition of the industry. So what we did is we used the city of Prince George, as a case study on how you could potentially develop a project in the north or in BC. And so what we did is we laid out the time frames, the steps you need to take, the costs required with what permits, and all these sorts of things, linking it back to the official community plan and our individual bylaws and all these sorts of things, to as well as some sort of simpler example-based cases where we gave an actual number to certain things, value of a project in square footage or acreage or whatever it is, leading to a cost for a permit, to really simplify it and lay out a roadmap for proponents coming in to get an idea of how the municipal level and the British Columbian regulatory sort of framework works. And that's been well received across the industry, across government, and that's been a big interest, and it's been a helping factor for Northern BC, our conversations to sort of grab the attention and put the North on the map. We also did the opportunity assessment, and I'll also mention the operating model. Both of these projects were procured through an RFP process. We ended up going with the team from Deloitte, very experienced and knowledgeable folks there, to really quantify what is possible in the north. We've seen with industry, no offense to our southern colleagues on the call here, but Victoria likes to make some choices or some decisions or say things are possible, and it doesn't translate as well as they'd like it to for the north. And so we really wanted to narrow down what's realistic and tangible for the north, so that we could realistically and tangibly focus our efforts to what our strengths were and how we can actually attract that investment and see that transition happen up here sooner, rather than waiting for Vancouver to figure it out and donate the findings to us in the north. Taking that information, we then marketed and went to industry outside of the region, some inside the region, to raise the awareness of the region. So, Prince George alone, northern BC alone, some folks in certain markets didn't even really know about British Columbia. They know about Canada, but just awareness about the investment opportunity here has been, it was a learning curve for them, and it's been a finding for us. And then we found, like I said, we started very Prince George centric and quickly shifted to a regional lens because our colleagues out in Prince Rupert, Terrace, really along the corridor, there's been some early adopting communities. We saw the Fort St. John and their CCUS work with Geoscience BC. So we stayed in touch, and by aligning our efforts, it's been made a bigger difference and given us a bigger spot on the map with certain proponents. And going forward now, the operating model is sort of, okay, well, as an example, Prince George is sort of the case study here, but really you could replace us with any municipality in northern BC. What role do you want to play going forward? Do you want to take an active role? Watch how things go. And each community, like I said, this collaboration across the region, it'll be strengthened by communities coming together and finding what we all share as a common goal to be able to pursue that together. And then the education and outreach needs to continue. Let's go to the next slide. This next slide is just a quick one, but essentially it kind of wraps up what we've been doing, these marketing materials, the case study, and some of our events. I'll plug a little event ahead of the BC Natural Resources Forum. We're hosting a Future Fuels Forum event that same week, focused on this low carbon fuel sector. You're more than welcome to come. I think we'll send out some information later, but it's free to attend. And we really want to celebrate and share the information around what's really happening in the north, and the fact that it's really possible up here. We've got something to offer the sector, and we can further diversify our communities, economies, keep jobs in our communities, and stay on the map for that investment. Let's go to the next slide. This slide is just sort of a depiction of, as far as we think we've come, we've got a long ways to go. This is, we're starting to see, the Edmonton Region Hydrogen Hub is a very respected and well-organized organization and hub. They're even not at sort of a steady state operations. They're still building things up as far as they've come. We're further behind them, but we're further along than some of our groups to the south in the States. And so we've got some steps to go, but as long as we sort of push along this roadmap, we could potentially see a really robust support network for the sector to happen. And then we can share information across communities and those sorts of things. Next slide. And this last one's just sort of a thought, food for thought of, I spoke to it a bit in the operating model piece, where, we have as a community, as the city of Prince George, as the North, as your own community, you have a decision to make. We've sort of determined that there's an opportunity in the North for the hydrogen sector, for low carbon energy development, and communities, governments, and economic development agencies. We have an opportunity to seize now, but we have to decide first: are we going to put the resources and efforts into being that leader, the first mover, a fast follower, or somebody who supports and observes and hops in where they can? And so that's a question you have to ask yourselves, and we're asking ourselves the same thing. But there's an exciting opportunity ahead of us, and so I think we've got some cool stuff ahead of us, and the work that Foresight's doing here to look into the Northeast, the work that Prince Rupert's doing, the projects being announced in the North. I think it's all coming together to see something quite exciting to keep jobs in the North and sort of be part of the next new energy sector that's coming along. So Thanks for your time, and I'm happy to answer questions later. I'm sure my contact information is out there somewhere, and I'd be more than willing to follow up after this call too. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Declan. We'll be sure to share Declan's contact information as well afterwards for those who are interested. I'll just share back our main presentation here.
See some questions popping up at me. I can be the sideshow if you want. So I'll kind of work from the bottom up. I see Jordan Tardy's sent in a question here around the biggest challenge in developing the hub. It's an interesting thing. So I mean, I saw a piece in there about and I've been aware that the Grand Prairie region has been looking at developing a hydrogen hub, and I'd say go for it. I think you guys are in a really good position around, you know, with the oil and gas activity that's already there, availability of hydrogen. You know, although maybe not blue or green quite yet, or as in large volumes, but to have that potential supply already. You know, the user base now is our biggest challenge. So we've been able to, like, our region, what we've found is, you know, our access to the BC Hydro grid with renewable power, large swaths of land zoned already for industrial use, a very pro-industry community, good strong workforce, things like that. Those all create a good strong environment for the development of and production of the fuels. And now our sort of challenge is the transition to the end use. You know, what trucking companies will be early adopters? Can municipalities get involved? Things like that. And there are definitely some things that, you know, we want to reduce risk, reduce anxieties around reliability or predictability. You know, moving from a diesel truck to a hydrogen truck is a bit of a leap. And so finding ways that we can sort of prove things out. There's a great initiative out in Prince Rupert and Terrace. Innovate BC is leading it, and they're actually going to be studying and posting publicly their data on the trucks that they're running on the road. They've got some hydrogen fuel cell trucks, electric truck, and a few hybrids, I think, running, you know, a short distance, we'll call it, short for northern BC, you know, the 150, 175 kilometers between Prince Rupert and Terrace. And they're monitoring that data, and they'll get that real time. So hopefully that reduces risk and concerns. But now using that to encourage those early adopters and then prove out that security and using that as a fuel source has been good.
Thanks again, Declan, for the transition there. We're going to jump into a poll question here. So like I said, just to gauge the experience of the folks who are attending, how familiar are you with hydrogen? Should pop up for you just a moment here. And once everybody's responded, we'll just launch the answers back for you. Great, so we've got a good mix. Most folks kind of have some basic knowledge at least, or are pretty familiar with the topic. Good to see. So hopefully we can add some value here to your existing knowledge base. So next, I'm just going to discuss a little bit about BC and how hydrogen fits into the clean energy transition. So you'll see two figures here that show the breakdown of BC's emissions by sector and over time. Take a moment to look and read through. As of 2020, BC's GHG emissions increased 20% since 1990 and declined 3% from 2005. As can be seen on the left diagram, the breakdown of sectoral emissions in BC based on 2020 data were transportation at 40%, buildings at 21%, industry, so it includes agriculture, smelting, cement, manufacturing at 20%, and oil and gas at 19%. Of note are the historically rising emissions in the transportation sector and the fossil fuel industry, both of which have applications from potential applications of low carbon hydrogen to reduce those emissions. At the federal level, there's been a commitment to reduce emissions nationwide, as I'm sure most on the call are familiar with. By 2020, our economy should either emit no GHG emissions or offset emissions according to the net zero commitment the federal government's made. These offsets can occur through technological or nature-based means to sequester or capture carbon dioxide. In BC, we have a commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. The BC government introduced the Climate Change Accountability Act in 2018, which put climate accountability into law for BC and mandated the creation of action plans, monitoring, and reporting, including establishing interim emissions reduction targets of 40% by 2030 and 60% by 2040. These commitments mean that exploring multiple low carbon energy sources, technologies, and innovations will be needed to meet emission reduction goals. You may hear the term decarbonizing in the media, or as we speak today. This is really what we're referring to, moving away from a reliance on carbon emitting energy sources. The provinces also has a provincial hydrogen strategy and hydrogen office, as I spoke about SEMPO earlier, along with a variety of programs and commitments that are relevant to hydrogen development. A couple include the commitment to introduce targets for the sale of zero emission, medium, and heavy duty vehicles. That would include both medium and heavy duty battery electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. The Hydrogen Fueling Infrastructure Program, which supports the installation of hydrogen fueling infrastructure across the province. And to remain a leader in low carbon fuel use and production, BC is increasing its target to 1.5 billion liters produced per year by 2030 of renewable fuels. And will also require a 10% reduction in the carbon intensity of jet fuel by 2030. Some additional work on hydrogen has happened in BC. So in addition to some of that local work, including what Declan was presenting there in Prince George, BC's produced and supported a number of publications of hydrogen, including, of course, the BC Hydrogen Strategy, Hydrogen Station Permitting Guidebook for BC, the Northeast BC Geological Carbon Capture and Storage Atlas from 2023, Carbon Intensity of Hydrogen Productions Method Report, which I'll speak about in a bit, as well as the BC Hydrogen Regulatory Mapping Study. These are all publicly available resources, and we'd strongly encourage you to review if you're interested. In addition, the province also supports hydrogen growth through a wide range of policies. Some of those include the Go Electric program and the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. Just a brief note on electricity, as it's often an important piece of the conversation. Electricity plays an important role in hydrogen growth and is commonly discussed the source of energy to replace carbon-intensive energy sources like fossil fuels to help reduce emissions, especially where electricity is generated from cleaner renewable sources. About 98% of the electricity produced in BC comes from renewable sources. So the question is, if BC has such abundant renewable electricity, then why do we need to consider a variety of energy sources to decarbonize the economy? Well, in many sectors of the economy, electrification does make sense and as a default option for decarbonization. However, electrification is not currently practical for all decarbonization use cases across our economy. And the challenge that we are faced with while confronting an urgent need to drive down emissions is that really no stone can be left unturned. Limitations of electrification can be due to, for example, the refueling or recharging requirements or other logistical needs of a particular application. An example of this is transoceanic shipping, particularly polluting industry. Based on current technologies and development, you would need an enormous battery that would take up quite a bit of space and weight in the ship and would need to last weeks without recharging to make that journey. So there's some logistical challenges right now that technology development is still working on. Over time, these technologies will, of course, continue to change and new cost reductions will be achieved as we're seeing in the trucking industry, for example. But specific applications will require that we target alternative sources of energy for decarbonization. There's also some potential supply constraints to consider, as has been talked about a bit in the media. The demand for electricity in BC is expected to grow significantly due to population growth, economic development, and the electrification of various sectors, including transportation, buildings, and industry. BC Hydro's electrification plan aims to address this by increasing the load by approximately 4,700 gigawatt hours by 2026, short term. BC's utilities do need to procure more power for new projects to meet these projected demands that economy-wide decarbonization and electrification presents. And the next IRP that BC Hydro will come out with will investigate this a bit further. Additional constraints that BC Hydro is considering, of course, are hydrological changes. As we're seeing in BC right now, climate change is expected to alter precipitation patterns, increasing temperatures, change the timing and volume of runoff. These changes can affect hydroelectric power generation, which relies on consistent water flows. There's also drought conditions, of course, as we've seen in BC, extended periods of dry and warm weather that have led to record low water levels in some reservoirs. This affects the ability to generate hydroelectric power consistently. And BC has experienced some of the driest and hottest extended periods on record recently, impacting water availability for power generation. Lastly, a brief note on extreme weather events in general. BC is already experiencing the effects of climate change, whether that's the wildfires, flooding, and droughts. These events can disrupt electricity supply, damage infrastructure, and have a general impact on our availability to distribute reliable electricity over the long term. So, for more information on the future of BC's electricity system, I'd really recommend anyone interested take a look at BC Hydro's latest integrated resource plan. As I said, keep an eye on the next one. So with that said, just some notes on the potential of hydrogen in BC. In the situations and use cases where electrification is perhaps not possible or feasible, low carbon hydrogen can complement electricity as a source of energy. Hydrogen as a fuel has unique advantages, which we'll discuss in the coming sections. It can also be made with a low carbon footprint. Just some other notes about bias. Of course, hydrogen is I'd say very polarizing right now. Generally, hydrogen is widely accepted to have some part of the clean energy transition in BC, though some people do strongly believe it'll play a smaller role, or others believe it'll play a larger role. I think because of these differing opinions, there's a lot of information out there that can be heavily biased. We've done our best to be objective and non-biased here, but it's worth keeping in mind to continue to scan the literature as new information comes out. So I have one more poll here before we dive into the core content. Just wanted to gauge interest. What would you like to learn more about when it comes to hydrogen as we develop some of this work in our next report? Very interesting. So cost and carbon intensity of hydrogen, fantastic. We'll get into that. What BC is doing to advance hydrogen, spoke about that a little bit. There's more information we can provide after. Keep an eye out for our report. All of these topics are important, and we look forward to diving in a little bit more. On the note about opportunities for your community to be involved in production, or your community to use hydrogen, we'll be speaking about that in more depth for folks who could be potential partners in Northeast BC at our in-person event, which we'll speak about a bit later. So first, what is hydrogen? Hydrogen is a gas, of course, lightest element on the periodic table. It's commonly found as a pair. That's why you see the H2. Hydrogen is not found naturally, though, as H2. It's a very reactive element, and so any naturally occurring hydrogen will be bonded to another element. This is important to note because any hydrogen we use is produced. Hydrogen as a molecule is commonly used today as a component of various industrial processes, such as refining petroleum products, metal production, chemicals, fertilizers, and industrial processing. The other new use for hydrogen is as a carrier of energy. Hydrogen requires an input of energy to produce it, and then we can use hydrogen as a low carbon fuel, as we mentioned, using the energy that it carries for those various applications. Hydrogen is being considered as a fuel for various applications, transportation, utilities, which we'll talk about a bit later. Hydrogen pathways are often referred to by colors in the media, but governments and industries are trying to move away from this. Nonetheless, it's still a commonly used term, so for the purpose of our work, we continue to discuss colors. Low carbon hydrogen can be made by a number of pathways that have low carbon intensity, or potential low carbon intensity, I should say, including, as you'll see kind of on this basic graph here, blue, green, and turquoise. Gray and brown hydrogen are, of course, not low carbon. They represent some of the existing ways that industries produce hydrogen and yield significant emissions. We'll speak more about each of the low carbon pathways next. So here you have two commonly referred to sources of hydrogen, and ones that are particularly relevant for the north: blue hydrogen and turquoise. We'll mention briefly that the production of gray hydrogen through steam methane reforming is currently the most cost-effective and widely used production process globally for hydrogen. This is primarily utilized for producing ammonia for fertilizers, upgrading petroleum products and refineries, but of course it has that very high carbon intensity. When CO2 is emitted during gray hydrogen production, it's captured or sequestered or utilized. The resulting hydrogen would then be blue hydrogen. The capture and sequestration of that CO2 can be achieved through various methods, including injecting the CO2 deep into the Earth's crust. Autothermal reforming, known as ATR, is a technology that's used to produce hydrogen for methanol and ammonia production. It's being proposed as a method to produce low carbon intensity blue hydrogen from natural gas because it enables higher rates of carbon capture compared to conventional SMR and at a lower cost. Turquoise hydrogen, on the other hand, is produced from natural gas through a process called pyrolysis, which produces solid carbon as a byproduct of CO2, which can be used in materials. This method has the potential to produce hydrogen with relatively low carbon intensity, as the resulting solid carbon byproduct mainly displaces carbon from other fossil sources. There are various ways natural gas pyrolysis technologies can be available. These technologies utilize electricity to drive the process, which can be particularly advantageous, of course, in BC, so long as we have the supply to meet that demand. Aformous black carbon, which is the byproduct of this process, is commonly used in industries worldwide for applications such as manufacturing rubber for tires, pigments and polymers, printing inks, and more. For pyrolysis, depending on the source of heat, the process may or may not emit GHGs, but emissions are significantly lower than methane reformation, even with CCUS, which we'll get into in a bit here. An important note is that electricity is also required for both blue and turquoise hydrogen, not just natural gas. Really rough estimate, about 2 kilowatt hours of electricity is required to produce 1 kilogram of blue hydrogen. Turquoise hydrogen also requires electricity, and there's some estimates on that in various reports. There's also waste hydrogen, which we'll get into. Waste hydrogen is often produced as a byproduct in various industrial processes. And that can include chlor-alkali production, sodium chlorate production, petrochemical refining, and steel manufacturing. In chlor-alkali process, for example, hydrogen is generated alongside chlorine and sodium hydroxide during the electrolysis of brine. Similarly, in petrochemical refining, hydrogen is produced during processes like catalytic reforming and cracking. Prominent hydrogen company in BC, HTEC, has an incoming liquefaction facility for byproduct hydrogen in North Vancouver. In the north, where the forestry sector is looking for opportunities to reduce emissions, byproduct hydrogen could be compressed and purified for use at pulp mills, for example. Hydra Energy, another BC company, which enables commercial fleets to convert existing diesel trucks to run on a hydrogen diesel mix, has partnered with Chemtrade to use some of that waste hydrogen to power dual fuel Class 8 trucks. That said, in public modeling that's available to us, waste hydrogen only represents a pretty small amount of hydrogen consumption and potential production in BC, so kind of take it with a grain of salt right now. Then, of course, as most folks know, there's green hydrogen. So this is hydrogen gas produced through a process that utilizes renewable energy sources such as wind, solar, or hydroelectric power to split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen in an electrolyzer. Unlike traditional hydrogen production methods, which often rely on fossil fuels like natural gas, these energy sources have low carbon intensities, in some cases close to zero. The process involves electrolysis, where an electric current is passed through water, causing it to break down into its constituent elements, hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen produced in this manner can then be stored and used as a clean energy carrier in various sectors, including transportation, industry, and power generation. When green hydrogen is burned or used in fuel cells to generate energy, the only byproduct is water vapor, making it a sustainable energy source. The electricity used does not necessarily need to be grid connected. It does require roughly about 55 kilowatt hours of electricity to produce 1 kilogram of hydrogen. We do have some information on this energy consumption in our last report for the Lower Mainland that's generic to BC. In 2019, those numbers are from, so of course that we'd estimate that would technology become more efficient as they improve. And it also requires a purified water source. There's some companies that are and research that are beginning to explore use of non-purified water sources, but that's very much in the development stage. HTEC has a incoming facility in Burnaby in the Lower Mainland that will produce green hydrogen via electrolysis. So responding to the interest from that poll, talk a little bit more about carbon intensity. This is an older graph, but a good one from the Pembina Institute that looked at the carbon intensity of various methods. When comparing these production pathways for hydrogen, there's really two main factors for discussion, and those are, of course, carbon intensity and relative cost. Uh, while the use of H2 doesn't produce any GHG emissions, the production of it can. In order to compare different methods of production, the concept of carbon intensity is used. The key point that is that when we're looking at the carbon intensity of any hydrogen production pathway, the entire life cycle associated with everything that is used is considered. So that includes the production of feedstocks, transportation, emissions associated with making all that infrastructure, hydrogen production process. So for example, this diagram from 2022 shows the carbon intensity of different hydrogen production methods. Blue hydrogen has greater carbon intensity in this case than green hydrogen. For blue hydrogen, really the actual value will depend on the carbon capture efficiency of the technology in question. And we'll go to a more recent analysis from the BC Centre for Innovation in Clean Energy that uses the GHGenius life cycle analysis model. This 2023 report titled the Carbon Intensity of Hydrogen Production Methods Report, which I mentioned earlier that was supported by the province of BC, provided new information on the carbon intensity of electrolysis, blue hydrogen production, and then turquoise hydrogen production. Of course, there's a lot of numbers here, and not the most beautiful image in terms of the pixelation. The idea is I would recommend for any interested to take a look at in depth at least the executive summary of this report. But if you're interested, the report as a whole, it really points out that there's varying carbon intensities and even shows some of the downstream carbon intensities of different production methods and whether that's transported by truck or pipeline to the destination. But you'll see in general that electrolysis is the lower pathway, depending on the technology used for blue, which is with methane reforming there on the left, can be lower, can be higher than pyrolysis. But generally, electrolysis via solid oxide or PEM is the lowest. Next on that piece about relative costs, the production cost of hydrogen pathways is impacted by, of course, feedstock costs, so that natural gas and electricity, capital costs and operating costs. Transportation costs are, of course, in consideration as well. This global chart from the International Renewable Energy Agency compares the cost of hydrogen production from fossil sources, so that gray, low carbon being blue, and hydrogen from electrolysis being green in 2021 and projected out to 2030. Because of the cost of electricity, green hydrogen, based on this estimate, is the most expensive to produce. However, many sources do project that those costs will decrease over time, as I mentioned, due to lower than natural gas sourced hydrogen. Blue hydrogen is less expensive, of course, has the cheaper feedstock of natural gas, but this is really dependent on the price of natural gas, which we've seen over the years can fluctuate quite significantly. It also requires CCUS infrastructure and may be subject to carbon taxes over time, depending on the policy of the day. Depending on the location and variety of factors, the most cost-effective hydrogen production option will vary. To get into as well a more recent study here, these charts show the cost pathways for blue, turquoise, and green hydrogen from the 2022 BC Renewable and Low Carbon Gas Supply Potential Study. For blue hydrogen, the price of natural gas is really the crucial factor, as I mentioned, after the cost of carbon sequestration. Assuming these plants are built at the source where natural gas is cheapest and sequestration opportunities are available, any rise in natural gas prices will negatively impact hydrogen costs. However, this is somewhat mitigated by the expectation in the study that sequestration costs will decrease over time. Capital costs are the most significant expense due to the need to install both SMR reactors and the carbon capture, compression, and sequestration infrastructure. For turquoise hydrogen, the cost of natural gas as feedstock remains, of course, again, the most significant factor. Since no carbon capture sequestration is required, the process is easier to locate and operate. However, the conversion efficiency is less than that of blue, and that leads to higher overall production costs. However, the sale of carbon black, as I mentioned earlier, that solid carbon product that can be a byproduct from pyrolysis, could offset these production costs. Producing an appropriate grade of carbon and establishing effective sales channels is another piece of work altogether. As the carbon feedstock is converted into carbon black rather than emitted, this can replace the fossil derived carbon black. And one of the interesting points about this is that turquoise hydrogen is then not affected by increasing carbon taxes, depending on the policy. In the chart associated with green hydrogen production, costs exceed $31 per gigajoule, with any incremental savings from efficiency enhancements offset by anticipated rises in electricity rates. Generating hydrogen off-grid would incur notably higher expenses, with significant variations observed between onshore in this study and offshore wind farms. The substantial capital expenditure for wind turbines and large-scale electrolyzer installations, coupled with the intermittent output of wind turbines, result in considerable off-grid hydrogen production costs, despite independence from grid electricity. In on-grid production, electricity expenses play a pivotal role, with fluctuations in electricity pricing exerting significant influence on hydrogen costs. Conversely, for off-grid setups, the producer assumes ownership of power generation assets, making capital costs for these assets and the electrolyzer farm the primary cost elements, although maintenance and operational expenses also hold significant. Of course, lower electricity costs would notably reduce the estimated unit cost for green hydrogen. So a lot of technical information, really in summary, in cases where electricity is not possible or cost effective, hydrogen has the potential as a low carbon source of energy. Electrolysis and reformation and pyrolysis are pathways to producing low carbon hydrogen. Cost and carbon intensity must be considered for each pathway, green being lower carbon intensity, higher cost at the moment, blue being higher carbon intensity, lower cost, turquoise with the potential to be lower cost at a higher carbon intensity. That said, with that byproduct sale is really what's contingent on that being the lowest cost. Next, I'll move into hydrogen transportation. So transporting hydrogen is another important consideration, of course. There's cylinders, trucks, or trains, pipeline, carrier, ship. By cylinder, hydrogen gas can be transported. It can also be liquefied by cooling it and transported in insulated cryogenic containers. This is expensive and consumes a lot of energy. Some hydrogen is also lost to evaporation. These are typically only transported by truck over short distances. Cylinders are then transported over land via truck or train, as seen in the photo here. As mentioned earlier, gaseous hydrogen can be transported through pipelines, similar to how natural gas is transported today. This method would allow for large volumes of hydrogen to be transported. There are some existing hydrogen pipelines today, but transporting hydrogen on a large scale would require the construction of new pipelines. And there's several studies that are beginning to explore what blending might look like. Hydrogen can also be transported by what is called a carrier. Hydrogen is used to produce ammonia or liquid organic hydrogen carriers, and these carriers are transported and then broken down at their destination to produce hydrogen as one pathway. I'll leave as a small note that Foresight's in the process of developing a very in-depth and technical report on the use of carriers, and so keep an eye out for that at the end of the year. As well as by ship. So for longer distances where pipelines are not an option, hydrogen can be liquefied by cooling it to extremely low temperatures and shipped via specialized tanker ships that are highly insulated and can maintain low temperature requirements. Just a brief note on hydrogen safety. So we touched on these. Hydrogen itself is not toxic, which means a leak or spill will not contaminate the environment. Burning hydrogen as a fuel will not produce any polluting substances. But there are still important environmental and safety risks to consider. Really, hydrogen is, of course, flammable, easily ignited. There are risks associated with uncontrolled combustion of hydrogen due to leakage. Fossil fuels are also flammable and easily ignited, so these are risks that fossil fuel companies are quite familiar with. Hydrogen is a colorless, odorless gas, and so it's hard to detect. And there's no known odorants right now that are light enough to be added to hydrogen, so it can be smelled. And so there's just various considerations that need to be in mind, including handling and storage, transportation, infrastructure development, fueling stations, and all of that. Going into using hydrogen. So there are really several ways that hydrogen can be used. I spoke about a few earlier. In this section, we'll talk about these use cases and the various applications associated, as well as how the hydrogen use case compares to other technologies or conventional methods. This is a really interesting diagram and discussed quite widely by those interested in hydrogen by Michael Liebrecht. This diagram is, I would say, a bit controversial and based purely on technical analysis. Also somewhat generic and biased towards the author's location, which is the UK. BC scenarios might have a different result. But it is interesting nonetheless to kind of see what some consider perhaps more competitive or unavoidable than others. You'll see kind of near at the top there, got fertilizer, hydrogenation, methanol, shipping, chemical feedstock, long-term storage of energy. Some of those at the bottom being metro trains and buses, light-duty cars, domestic heating are considered a bit more uncompetitive. The first I want to talk a little bit about is fuel cells. So one way we can use hydrogen is as an energy source in a fuel cell. Fuel cells function like a battery. Hydrogen is added as a fuel and ultimately creates electricity, water, and heat. Fuel cells are being explored as an alternative to traditional internal combustion engines for transportation applications. Vehicles which are powered by fuel cells are typically referred to as fuel cell electric vehicles. As I mentioned in the previous slide, right now, most consider that light duty hydrogen vehicles are largely uncompetitive compared to battery electric vehicles. BEVs are battery electric vehicles, I should say, are more prevalent for passenger vehicles, require a charging period similar to conventional ICE, internal combustion engine vehicle. So the advantage really of the fuel cell electric vehicles, the refueling time, similar to conventional ICE, whereas the BEVs are currently more prevalent due to their cost and availability of electrical infrastructure. There are a few active fueling stations in BC, one in the Lower Mainland, or three in the Lower Mainland, I should say, one in Burnaby, one in Vancouver, and one in North Vancouver. There's additional planned stations that HTEC has in Tsawwassen, Surrey, and Vancouver. Another use case is combustion. So hydrogen can be directly burned as a fuel, similar to how someone would combust natural gas or methane as a fuel. Using hydrogen for building heating is as a proposed avenue that some utilities are beginning to explore to reduce the carbon intensity of gas supply. This would involve blending it with natural gas and injecting it into pipelines, which are currently used for heat and power in buildings. However, logistical and safety challenges are really a big hurdle, and some of the pipelines would need to be retrofitted or new pipelines would need to be constructed to accommodate the hydrogen gas. To carry the same amount of energy as natural gas, hydrogen requires a 3 times larger pipeline, it requires more energy to distribute. So the cost of doing this is much higher than the current price of gas. Fortis BC has commissioned a comprehensive blending feasibility study with support from the government of BC for its distribution network across the province. However, recent analysis from the BC Centre for Innovation and Clean Energy found that blending hydrogen into the provincial gas grid would really only yield emissions reductions of about 1.7 to 4%. So really, there does appear to be better uses for hydrogen than heating throughout the economy, and alternative technologies for decarbonization in some cases, such as electricity for building heating, whether it's heat pumps or more efficient gas furnaces as they currently stand, may be better for certain local use cases. Co-combustion technology for heavy-duty transportation is also another avenue. So this is the other side of the coin to the transportation elements that we spoke about in the previous slide on fuel cells. BC company Hydro Energy uses this method to blend hydrogen with traditional fuels in heavy-duty engines, as I mentioned earlier. And co-combustion is I would say a limited alternative to fuel cell and battery electric trucks in specific hubs, while those technologies continue to be commercialized and low carbon hydrogen is available in the supply. Brief note on industrial processes. So hydrogen, of course, holds significant potential as a decarbonization solution in various industrial processes due to its ability to serve as a carrier and a chemical feedstock. There's hydrogen as a fuel, hydrogen for hydrogenation reactions, hydrogen as a chemical feedstock. Various chemical manufacturing, processes can use hydrogen. Hydrogen for steel production, for heat, power generation, and others, as we mentioned here. To really fully realize the decarbonization potential of hydrogen in industrial processes, there are several challenges that need to be addressed, including that cost competitiveness element of hydrogen compared to fossil fuels, and the scalability of hydrogen production and distribution infrastructure, which remains a challenge. On the topic of renewable energy storage, so hydrogen can be used as a form of energy storage. Electricity, when generated with renewable sources, can also be used as a competitor. Let's say using hydrogen for energy storage in remote situations can be a complement. This can help communities transition away from reliance on diesel power generation. However, there's still emerging research investigating the competitiveness of this and whether the economics make sense. And another is synthetic fuels. Hydrogen is essentially a component in the development of synthetic fuels. So it's another piece of that transportation coin. Synthetic fuels are manufactured. They don't come from naturally occurring crude oil, but have the same properties so that they can be used in same ways conventional fuels, such as diesel or jet fuel. Synthetic fuels are likely to be needed as a replacement for aviation and marine fuels, for which electrification, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, are not quite feasible at this moment. And those are considered hard to, quote unquote, hard to decarbonize sectors because of the long distances and the weight and space limitations. One to note is methanol, which is commonly used today as an industrial chemical, but can be also used as a fuel, and it's being explored as potential alternative fuel, in particular for shipping and applications. Ammonia is another that's widely discussed, one of the most widely produced industrial chemicals globally and quite versatile but highly toxic. Um, Ammonia does not produce CO2 emissions when combusted, as a commonly transported and produced substance. And then there's SAF, so non-fossil derived jet fuel, almost identical to conventional jet fuel and can be used as what's called a drop-in fuel. So basically no technology retrofitting would be required for those applications to use SAF. And lastly, just a brief note on an export commodity. At this stage, hydrogen supply is quite low, and so there's low likelihood in the interim for any export of hydrogen. However, there is potential over time if there's a growing global demand and supply scales up for hydrogen to be exported to other countries if there were a surplus. And BC, of course, due to the West Coast, is geographically well positioned to export hydrogen to major markets, perhaps in Asia or to our neighbors in the south, due to our deep sea ports and robust transportation infrastructure and connections to Alberta. So to summarize, some of the ways we can use hydrogen include in a fuel cell for transportation applications, can be combusted for building heating, used in industrial processes like the making of petroleum, metals, chemicals, a way to store energy, or it can be used to make synthetic fuels such as methanol, ammonia, or sustainable aviation fuels. And really depending on determining the best use of hydrogen depends on quite a few factors, as we mentioned. So I'll just jump into our last poll question before we wrap up. Thanks, folks, for staying with us and for bearing with us for some technical issues and delays in the presentation there. Just like to know where you see opportunities for hydrogen in your community. We've got as options there, renewable energy storage, methanol, shipping and rail, non-road mobile machinery, ammonia, production, personal vehicles, long distance trucking, or production via blue or turquoise hydrogen. Interesting. Thanks for responding, everybody. So production via green, obviously at the highest, personal vehicles there as well, shipping and rail, renewable energy storage. So with that, I would like to wrap up and thank you for joining us today. Foresight's work on BC's hydrogen hubs will continue throughout the province for another year. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we investigated the Lower Mainland first, now the Northeast. Then we'll move on in 2025 to Interior BC and Vancouver Island. This workshop is part of a series of engagements across the province that will seek to grow awareness of hydrogen and collect community perspectives on its role in BC's low carbon energy future. A report for the Northeast will be released publicly in January. So for any of the information that we went through quicker today or didn't get enough information on, just stay tuned and we'll have more in-depth exploration in that report. We look forward to diving in more deeply to the unique needs and challenges of the Northeast. And a quick note on two more events upcoming for Hub partners. So we have an in-person workshop in Fort St. John that any folks interested can reach out to me. As well as a webinar discussing the potential transportation of hydrogen via carriers such as ammonia and methanol that we discussed earlier in the presentation. That report will go into great technical detail and be quite valuable for anybody interested in hydrogen production in the north. Check out the events page on our website for more information on both. And thank you once again. We really appreciate your attendance and wish you a really great rest of your day.